systemic problem in that area that can't be solved only by tree regulation.
Jackie, this,
City of Atlanta recently passed a change to their zoning allowing accessory dwelling units in the backyard. And Decatur has it. The question is, and that's maybe the best opportunity in neighborhoods of high real estate values to get some smaller living units. The question is, if people are trying to rent them at the maximum economic value, that may exceed the, that might kick them out of the affordability category. But certainly that is one option.
I think those are, there's another affordability problem that's built into that, which is Airbnb. Okay, so that it becomes very difficult for long-term long-term rentals to be feasible. Yeah, I'd like to just make a couple of comments. One is if the code says that you can create this very large footprint and grade your entire property, what you will always have is value by square footage, and every time a property turns, you're going to get a very large footprint. If we say that we're going to have a sustainable footprint, and that leaves us a little bit of room, can't save all the trees, but we can save our better trees to create a sustainable footprint, then you can have a one-story house with a smaller footprint, maybe it has a smaller square footage, but we can have a two-story house that has a larger square footage. So you can still get that value. You can have houses built to individual lots so that you can build in those higher values. So what you do is you create the opportunity for diverse price points. If you don't create that sustainable footprint, you're never going to create that incentive for diverse answers to how to build on lots. I want to just make a little bit of a comment about these accessory structures. When we add these accessory dwellings to an already large home, and we don't have it, I mean, if we have a sustainable footprint, you could have a small home and a large accessory structure, or two small ones, or something like that. But when we add an accessory structure to already a large footprint home, we're actually getting the opposite result, because those accessory structures are built in as a financial amenity so that people can afford that big, expensive house. And often that's going to Airbnb. So what we're doing is we're actually supporting an increase in house prices with these accessory structures. And think about how this is going to be in our community. Workforce families are not going to live in an accessory structure in the back of somebody's big house. That's culturally really not going to happen. So I think we need to really carefully consider these accessory structures, because when we add them to an already large footprint house, we're clearing that whole entire lot.
this question has to do with climate change. So scientists have told us we have about 12 years, and that was a year ago almost now, to deal with, in a major way, climate change. So why is the time now to make improvements in the context of climate change?
It's a question saying 12 years is a long time. Climate change is here now. I mean, that's just a reality. The duration of rain events, the weeks on end of rain, it's here now. And as I said it in my presentation, all cities are struggling with bad infrastructure. I won't say all, most. If they're at any age, when you get 50, 60-year-old pipes, they're going to start to leak. So it's not just City of Decatur, it's not just City of Atlanta, they're all dealing with that. Now, the problem with infrastructure is that you don't see it, out of sight, out of mind. But the requirement is, particularly under the Clean Water Act, that issues with infrastructure have to be addressed because we cannot allow sanitary sewage to mix with stormwater and get discharged in waters and parks where people play. That's just not going to happen. So I think there needs to be some serious conversations about this whole issue of stormwater utility, which certificator's talking about, but also how to mitigate the impact by requiring developers who are taking out the trees, and it's not an unreasonable request to look seriously at the problem that they are creating when they take out all of the trees and cover it all with impervious surface without giving any real thought or consideration to where that stormwater is going. And grass is not the answer either. Because it's very, grass becomes compacted and hard and it almost acts as concrete. So all I'm saying is that we have a big problem here with stormwater. Every city does. They have a big problem with infrastructure. Infrastructure is important. Nobody wants to pay for it. Government's not. So it's going to end up in higher water and sewer bills. The public is that's the pass-through. That's where the cost is going. Whether you do something about it or you don't, that's where it's going.
Sorry, I lost the question.
While he's looking over, a thought occurred to me. I think the city is in the middle of a stormwater master planning effort, and as it should be. But to really understand how to protect the forest, I think we need a sort of forestry master plan. Most of the premises of the ordinance, as I understand it, come from sort of inherited numbers that are old. And I don't know the basis of those numbers. And at what point has a comprehensive study been done of, how much forest really do we have to protect? Where is it critical? How are we going to do it? Approached in a professional manner, rigorously, in the same way that you would study stormwater. That could inform our ordinance process and our regulatory process in a way that would, I think, be rational and not just emotional. I'd like to just add something to that. Whereas a lot of times, watershed or arborist department typically operate in silos. And what we need to do, all these things are integrated. It's like going to the doctor, and our heart doctor gives us a medication that actually compromises what our lung doctor is trying to do. And I think we need to approach it holistically and work for sustainable solutions. And that we talk about sustainability a lot, but we see it in our master plans, we see it in our overarching goals, but we don't see it where the rubber meets the road in the code. We got to get sustainability into the code.
Many of us, if not all of us, grew up thinking that whatever is on our private property, we can do with whatever we want. So if I don't want that tree, I could just be able to take it down. It's on my property. But trees have benefits that extend beyond the private lot. They have a public benefit. And if I live next door to someone who's taking down a lot of trees, and my yard floods, now, cities are recognizing that there are these impacts. Similarly, just to reinforce, I think, Amy's excellent point in her presentation, when you build at the beach, you have to respect the forces of nature. You can't build and disrupt, the dunes, for example. You have to respect the fact that your land could flood, therefore you build on stilts. So why is that? Why should our urban environment be any different? Why can't we all learn to do that? And I think that's something that I've learned from looking at this issue more closely in this tree ordinance proposed set of changes, is we're all going to have to change. And in fact, we already have been changing. Anyone who says, oh, a builder can't change, a developer can't change, well, that's not true. The way a builder builds a home today is significantly different than 20 or 30 years ago. Codes are changing constantly. There may be incremental changes, but still the net effect is they have to do things differently. And just tell them what they have to do and know that they are not being penalized any differently than anybody else, and they will do it. It's just that simple. And it has to, well, maybe not quite that simple, but there has to be education, there has to be enforcement that's uniform, which has been an issue with the tree ordinances, as was raised here earlier. But it's just, thinking has to change. I just want to add one other thing about stormwater. The city of Atlanta has already had some significant flooding issues in parts of the city, and they've spent millions of dollars to fix neighborhoods where homes were being flooded. I don't know if you all have read about that in the news in the last 5-10 years. So the pictures you showed of this exploding manhole, that's not as those issues start to compound in the metro area, people aren't going to put up with their homes flooding. They're going to start suing the city or the county, wherever they live, and they're going to expect that that their government is going to fix that, and that's going to cost millions. And so when we don't incorporate dealing with that at the point that property is getting developed or redeveloped, we're just kicking that can down the road.
Okay, we've got about 4 more minutes now. There was one question that was also clarifying for Catherine. How do you recognize old growth, and what exactly does that term mean?
That's a great question. So in our area, old growth, to me, means it has a connection to that original forest that was on this part of the southeastern United States. In our area, only, less than 200 years ago, right? So the remnants of that forest we can find. How do we find it? We find it by certain species of trees. A lot of times we think they're really large trees, but for instance, post oaks can be an old growth tree at a fairly small size. So size of trees, the location of these trees, oftentimes if we have diverse species on the same property, and then we have indicator species. So the kind of things that we might find in Fraser Forest or Fernbank Forest or some of the species over there at the edge of Shoal Creek, that forested area, we can look on the ground and we can find certain native species that their seeds are not blown by the wind, the seeds are not carried by wildlife. Those plants are the offspring of the plants that have lived on that property for thousands and thousands of years. So there are certain clues on how we can find old growth. I'd be happy to talk about that more in detail if anyone would like.
Okay, there are a number of questions here of people who want to take action in different ways. So I'm going to sort of encapsulate some of those and ask 2 questions, which is, what do you think about the recent proposed changes to Decatur's tree ordinance? And what would be the one change to the current tree ordinance that would have the biggest potential positive impact on trees and the environment?
Okay, I am fairly familiar with a number of the proposed changes. There are a couple of good changes. I think there's changes to boundary trees, which is actually pretty good. From what I have read, at the moment, most of the changes that have been proposed don't really change the current tree ordinance of how it is now. There's a lot of detail in that, but as Amy had pointed out, there was a requirement to maybe go up to 35% canopy, but at the same time, there's another little clause that got added in that you can count your larger trees twice, which actually brings that down to about 12%. So, and the highest that it would possibly be is about 35%, even though it really isn't 35%. It's also measured in canopy, just to get an idea of how confusing that could be. If you have a large tree in the back of your lot and the canopy extends from the buildable area into the setback, then you have to calculate the amount of canopy in the setback, the amount of canopy in the buildable area, but you get twice the credit for the amount in the buildable area. How do you add that all up? And then it's actually the discretion of the arborist of how to figure that all out. So the regulations are very vague, and I would say complicated, needlessly so, and the enforcement of them has a lot of discretion, so that there's a lot of there's a lot of may. You may have to build around this. You may not have to. I would say that the Decatur ordinance recommendations in their current form are less clear, more complicated, and less exacting than in most other jurisdictions. And the adherence to the concept of canopy makes it more confusing. I don't know how much more detail I should go into, but basically it's not doing a whole lot compared to what Decatur has now. Right now, on most lots, we're losing, I would say, legally taking, about 75 to up to 80 or 90% of the trees on lots is legal now. The changes that have been proposed will not change that significantly.
Who's going to take that question?
I think there are simple answers. You should not be allowed to, for any reason that you so choose, remove 3 trees in 18 months. That's increasing to 24 months. It's still 3 trees that might take a human lifetime to reach maturity, full maturity. 25% is not enough. 35% is enough. If your goal as a city is to have 50%, and about 80% of the trees in the city are on private property, then the percentage to be maintained on private property has to go up. It's simple math. So the goal needs to be established more rationally, perhaps through a mechanism of some kind of study, as I was referring to earlier. But the private property requirements would need to be at least in keeping with what the city's goal is. If the city has a goal of 50%, well, then the least you can do is 50%. I would imagine.
So the last question that came up in terms of activism, which a lot of these are, is what can we do as resident citizens?
I always come down on the side of a strong leader to push your issue or any issue. Bureaucracies are, by their very nature, incredibly slow, incredibly convoluted, incredibly non-decisive. And to put these kinds of decisions squarely in the hands of folks who, I'm not being disparaging about it, I'm just saying that's what they do, that's who they are. And I made the same comment in the city of Atlanta, about the city of Atlanta. They have spent a whole lot of money on something that's called the ecological framework. They have a national consulting firm they brought in from from Charleston, South Carolina, to do it. And I've made many comments. I've had several meetings with the group, and they ask you about what do you think about this and you think about that, and I tell them. So let me ask you a question. Where is the mayor on this? Because if she's not for it, it's not going to happen. And I say that here because it takes leadership. It takes someone with a vision who sees the benefit of all we talked about. That's, if you get whomever, the mayor, the city manager, whomever it is in Decatur, in a room like this and say, let's talk about how we're going to fix this problem. because the arborist can't fix it. It's going to take something more.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, the four-step plan is a very good model to operate on. You have to have sort of a vision of how to get from here to there. So first of all, you have to agree to where there is. And if City of Decatur wants to retain 50% of its canopy, and a lot of that needs to be in its existing trees, how do you get there? The four-step plan really works on how to get there. And you know, this has been vetted by developers and builders. It can really work. And so I think that what we need to do is sit down. I would recommend maybe a work session and really explain step by step by step how this works, and you know, have citizens who are interested and staff and decision makers all kind of sit down and look at it. That would be my recommendation.
I apologize to those of you that submitted questions that we didn't get to, but the panelists will be around if you want to ask those questions later. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you for coming and asking questions.